Only a fool, or an idiot, would take the plunge on such a new and developing standard. But that didn't stop me from running out and buying one. Time for an honest review of this new tech. I'll start with gaming performance, even though it's by far the most underwhelming and disappointing feature. Here you can see gaming benchmarks for my Geforce 670 in 4K when compared with HD. There are plenty of places online that already offer benchmarks such as these, so this video will instead be about what 4K feels like to use, both in general and in particular games. In fact, let's start with pictures, which sums up the problem I have with it nicely. I looked at some high quality 4K wallpapers online, since I figured that this would be a good way of demonstrating 4K superiority. Nope, I couldn't see the difference. Don't get me wrong, it looked nice and crisp, but it's as though my brain had suddenly forgotten what HD looked like, despite having used it for the past decade. It wasn't until I compared it side by side with my old HD monitor that the difference was noticeable, and even then it wasn't massive. It's not going to change the picture. It's still going to have the same features and blemishes. In fact, 4K probably makes those more obvious. It was only when I compared some tiny detail on the screen, like a distant rock or some windows, that I could appreciate the improvement, as though the draw distance was a bit further before details were reduced to a hazy mess. Which you'd expect, given more pixels. What I didn't expect was how little I cared. In fact, it made me appreciate HD a lot more. With hindsight, I feel that it's the sweet spot between clarity and performance. It was a jump up from SD and the mess of resolutions that we had before it. It united consoles, TVs and PCs alike and has served us faithfully for years. With 4K, you can stare at any spot in the screen and make out more individual detail, but in practice, you don't. In the past, I would zoom into pictures to get a more detailed view of the interesting bits, and I ended up doing the same with 4K, even if every pixel was visible pre-zoom. In other words, it's got to the stage where the size of the thing you're looking at is more important than the amount of detail present on it, even if your eyesight isn't the problem. We humans are capable of seeing more details than HD, it's just that I personally don't care about what those improvements are. And I love graphics and technology. I can imagine that 4K will be handy in one-off instances, like those rare occasions where you have to confirm kills from across a map. But for things where it's more about viewing a small detail on a picture, or for recreating an impossible scene from CSI, it's the resolution of the media itself that matters rather than the monitor on which it's viewed. And now, as I promised, I'll try it out in games. The problem I mentioned previously rings true here as well, but on top of that there are other issues. At the moment, we're in an awkward situation where we can choose between running new games in 4K at unplayable frame rates, or older games that would run it well but probably don't support it. At these resolutions, it's the graphics card that's the limiting factor. You can see on this chart how my Geforce 670 compares to your setup. I know that my PC isn't particularly powerful anymore, which is kind of what makes this test exciting. Most of us don't have multiple top-end GPUs, so a PC like mine will probably help to show what an average gaming PC is capable of. Fortunately, I can power the monitor at 60Hz, which should help me to review these games in the best possible light. My older Radeon 6870 can only run at 30Hz, which is horrible for gaming, and my old potato laptop can't even output at 4K. Looks like it's up to you, main PC. And another note, if you think that games are poorly supported at 4K, try recording at that resolution. Only the latest generation of Nvidia graphics cards supports shadowplay recording footage at 4K. I don't have one of these, and Fraps craps its pants and crashes the moment I try to record it, which is just as well, otherwise my hard drive probably would. Because of this, I apologise for the lowly HD recordings that I'll show here. We really are exploring new territory. Surprise, surprise, the original Operation Flashpoint, released in 2001, happily supports it and can still bring my PC to its knees when on highest settings. I booted up the old Battlefield scenario, which recommends a 1 GHz processor. Somehow I don't think they were expecting the trials of 4K. I must have run down this hill 100 times, but never with such clarity. The tops of distant trees could be identified and long-range headshots confirmed. But other than that, the graphics are still from 2001 and don't really do 4K justice. I didn't even bother recording the frame rates with this game. You know you can handle it, provided you have at least a 1 GHz processor. Counter-Strike Global Offensive is the one you all want to know about. It ran well at 4K, and by that I mean that everything looked like it should. The HUD and options scaled beautifully, and there were no more glitches than normal. But there were problems, not specifically with 4K. Frame rate wise, I was getting about 100 FPS on average, which you'd think would be okay for a 60Hz monitor, but it wasn't. Moving the mouse felt jerky and I was at a serious disadvantage when compared with my normal play. Turning off anti-aliasing boosted the frame rate to about 140, which improved things substantially, but it wasn't until I dropped to HD and got a solid 250 FPS that it felt as responsive as it could have done. But it was great at these modes. I've been used to a 120Hz screen, but I could quite happily play with this monitor at HD resolutions. The input lag was non-existent with the Asus PB287Q, which is something that most larger monitors fall down on. In conclusion, for competitive gaming, this monitor is probably the best 4K 28-inch screen that you can currently get. And most importantly, the gun models look great. It's easy to see that they've been designed with 4K in mind, and they certainly display more clarity than HD can provide. Here are a few of my skins. If you want me to demonstrate more, then please give me them. I also gave Left 4 Dead 2 and Portal 2 a go. It's disheartening to see Source games running at lower than 100 FPS, but they were both fluid enough to sustain 60 FPS, but like CSGO, they weren't optimal, though it's not as important in games such as these. If you have a graphics card like mine or better, Source will run at 4K, but I'd still rather have the FPS boost that HD provides, particularly in Left 4 Dead 2 where it really helps your accuracy. Arma 3 is a demanding game, but is very scalable. I did a number of tests. The first involved the intro sequence at HD and at 4K to see the performance drop. Amazingly, during this section, 4K only lowered it by between 15 and 20%. I suspect that scripted sequences such as these are more CPU limited. In actual gameplay, the impact was more noticeable. Using their recommended settings during gameplay, 4K only managed 40% of the frame rate, identical to CSGO's results. All was not lost for 4K, however. Starting with the lowest details and slowly adding to them, I was able to double my FPS while still retaining decent graphical fidelity. With details such as these, I could manage 60 FPS most of the time, dropping to 50 FPS in cities. Skyrim next. I have no problem running it in HD or even in 3D mode, but 4K brought it below the important 60 FPS mark. With both 2x anti-aliasing and FXAA, I got the same 40 FPS. Disabling anti-aliasing raised it by a few important frames per second and made it a lot more responsive, even if it wasn't 100% perfect. I didn't bother to tamper with other graphics settings, but I'm sure that if you're willing to sacrifice quality a bit, then you could get a solid 60 FPS with this game. 4K in this game really looks gorgeous. There's a lot of spiky and messy looking stuff in this game, and 4K really gave clarity to the edges. I could appreciate distant views a lot more, even though they're not exactly that detailed. The HUD scaled beautifully apart from the level up text, which was always present on the screen even when I didn't need it. GTA 5 is annoying at the best of times for insisting that you need graphics RAM to be able to run certain settings, and sadly, the high resolution textures had to go for me to even be able to load this game at 4K. And worse still, 4K was only 36% of the frame rate that HD was. This was when I had an idea. The real benefit of 4K is distant detail. That's in your gun model, but this isn't Counter-Strike. I ramped down the texture and close-up settings and set the draw distances to maximum, and sure enough, it looked great. Sure, it might only have been console quality close-up, but I didn't really care since GTA 5 isn't an ugly game even at those settings, plus it meant that I had beautiful distant scenery all around me as well as perfectly playable FPS. I had a good battle against the police on a skyscraper with excellent frame rates at 4K and could really appreciate it on a sandbox game like this. So I decided to boot up Cities Skylines, which I've never considered too taxing a game. Despite this, I was surprised by how low my frame rates were, even at HD settings. This goes to show that for slow-paced management games such as this one, you don't need 60 FPS. Upping it to 4K made the average frame rate drop by 40% from 44 to 26. It was a bit more jerky but still playable, and it really looks better in 4K thanks to its emphasis on quantity over quality. It's great to be able to see distant structures with more clarity since the game's focus is on the grand scale of city building. It seems as though you had to set your desktop to 4K for the game to be able to run at this setting though. Just a word of warning if it keeps reverting for you. Another, even more impressive example of 4K was Rome 2 Total War. The campaign map looked crisp and clear. I noticed things like details on the trees and cities that I hadn't seen before, and although the frame rate was halved, I didn't feel it negatively impacted on the experience at all. The battles were beautiful. It still maintained at least 20 FPS at all times at ultra settings, and the armies went from pixelated messes to tidy rows of people, kitted out with shiny looking gear. I was almost sick after going back to HD. Quantity over quality any day for me on this game. I may even give the campaign another go, using low details but high resolutions. This is what 4K does well. And finally, the age-old question, can it run Crysis 3? The answer is, sort of. At 4K, I was getting around 30 frames a second on lowest details. On high settings, a solid 20. At very high, I couldn't run Crysis. This game has very consistent frame rates. But run the same high settings at HD resolutions and I was getting over 100, making the jump to 4K worse with Crysis than with any other game that I tested. I'll show you a load of 4K screenshots because it's still one of the prettiest games out there, but I simply can't justify the impact it has on gameplay just to be able to run it at 4K. In conclusion, if you can comfortably run games at high settings at HD, then you should be able to get away with passable 4K frame rates provided you turn down some of the details, unless the title in question is Crysis. But is it worth it? I'd say that for the majority of games, it isn't. If you have to sacrifice the quality of distant scenery in exchange for seeing their flaws in higher detail, it feels like a double whammy and makes even modern games look like they're from the previous generation, or sometimes even further back. 4K works best for games that deliver quantity rather than quality, such as RTSs or strategy games. For fast-paced games, I can't justify or appreciate the extra clarity in expense of the frame rate. So yeah, genre matters more than individual titles. I'm somewhat spoiled since I also have a 120Hz screen, and I did notice the drop to 60Hz that my 4K monitor supports. But this isn't the main problem. What's worse is that I'm not capable of running any game at a frame rate high enough for 4K to genuinely shine. With more beautiful, graphically intensive games I can't manage 60 FPS, and with those where I can, they're often more Twitch-based games where 150 frames a second or more is desirable. But this is my fault more than the technology's. If you're willing to invest enough into your PC, then you will be able to run today's games at 4K with everything on high. But do you want to? I feel that today is a very bad time to buy a new computer, what with both the next generation of CPUs and GPUs coming out in the next few months, which will either increase performance or lower prices of existing tech. And even then, I don't think the hardware will be future-proof for long. 4K is the biggest leap in resolution that I've encountered in a long time, and hardware won't be ready for it overnight. For now, even hardcore gamers may prefer the smaller graphical overhead that gaming at HD has, which will instead allow for them to ramp up the anti-aliasing, enable tessellation and all of the other fancy effects that today's games have. All things being equal, I would rather game at 4K than at HD, but you have to make so many sacrifices for the luxury that it's currently not worth it. Another big issue is that if I run HD resolutions on my 4K screen, it looks as blurry as a TV screen. If I didn't know better, then I would say it looks like 1280 by 720. This surprised me since it should be able to simply double up the pixels since 4K is exactly twice the width and height of Full HD. But it doesn't work like that. Because of this, I will only be using my 4K monitor for 4K, and that excludes most games at the moment. Earlier I said that it was hard to appreciate the improvements that 4K delivers. But it's worse than that. When I look back at my old HD screen, it looks blockier than it used to. Making the jump is the worst of both worlds. If you're going to make the leap to 4K, don't expect it to bring you happiness. It will only make you an elitist. A similar thing happened when I used a 120Hz screen for the first time. Let me quote my review. I was kind of disappointed in games when I moved to my 120Hz screen. It's not instantly going to make you awesome if you sucked before, and I could hardly notice the difference until I went back to my old monitor again. Now I can definitely feel the difference and wouldn't want to return to 60Hz when playing twitchy games, and if given the choice, I'd favour higher FPS than higher resolutions. HD is a sweet spot. Appreciate it for its strengths whilst you can. That being said, 4K will inevitably become the standard sometime in the future. With this video I can only offer my first impressions with this new technology, and I conclude that for gaming, and probably movies and pictures as well, that it isn't worth it. Yes, it boosts your EPEAN to insane levels, and lets you take outrageous screenshots that you can then send to friends to remind you of how superior you are. But inside you probably don't feel too amazing for having shelled out so much money for the privilege. In conclusion, a bit like 3D, 4K would be worth it if it could deliver its benefits without any compromises, but at the moment, it can't. Wait until you can get at least a 120Hz display and a computer capable of running games at that frame rate. But until then, enjoy the frame rate benefits that a lower resolution provides. I'll probably use my 4K screen to replay older single-player games where it's more about being immersed in a place than hitting targets with sub-pixel accuracy, which is somewhat ironic when you think about it. And I was impressed with the support the games that I ran had for it. I was expecting buggy menus and out-of-place text, but they were all practically perfect, which kind of made the comparison videos that I've shown between HD and 4K pointless since I can only capture at HD resolutions anyway. But this is a good thing, right? 4K isn't bad. It's just in its early stages and the rest of the world hasn't quite caught up yet. But even now, it's excellent for some things which I'll be covering in another video. Click here to see what those perks are and whether it may help you to justify getting that 4K monitor that's been gnawing away at you every time you load up Amazon.